So some general advocacy organizational tips, and I may have shared a little bit about these things earlier in the program, but I just want to say just in general, because a lot of these advocacy things are very specific to the United States or to a particular area, but in general, I think these are great for anybody. So you want to keep a journal or a calendar of phone calls and meetings with the names of who you spoke with, what you requested, what they promised they would do. When Lucas was little, that's kind of the advice I got, which was good advice. But if you don't do the second step here, keeping all those records really isn't going to do you much good if you do end up in some kind of due process case or mediation or fair hearing. Because your records aren't really that strong of evidence that you made that request. Because if the request was just oral request over the phone or in a meeting, you can't prove that it was made. So step number 2 here is really, really important. So you want to memorialize important phone calls and meetings with an email. And I'm going to show you an example in the next slide. Within that email, if you can, highlight safety concerns. Although you want to be careful not to appear unable to care for your child's needs. I have had an acquaintance who I told, kind of how I advocated for Lucas's waiver as he got older. And she played up the fact that her daughter, who was 16, was aggressive towards her 1.5-year-old son. And, if she turned her back, the 16-year-old would grab the 1.5-year-old. And then, a week later, Children and Youth came to her door to evaluate whether the 1.5-year-old was safe. So I do want to kind of give you that information, just not to scare you, but just to be like, you do want to highlight safety concerns, but you always want to make sure you kind of make it clear that you have things under control. So here's an example of the way I would memorialize a meeting with an email. So after the meeting, I would write in an email or a letter that you would deliver, Mrs. Smith, thank you for meeting with me today to discuss Jay's lack of progress on his goals and his recent attempts to leave the recess area and run towards the street. I'm relieved that you are as concerned as I am about Jay's safety and have agreed to provide a one-to-one during the recess period who will remain with him within an arm's distance to him at all times while outside. So there you have, it's not just a one-to-one, but now you're putting that you talked about having that one-to-one be within an arm's distance. That way, if he does leave the recess area and goes into the street, they are liable because that one-to-one was not within arm's distance, for instance. So these 2 paragraphs, then the 3rd paragraph, as I stated at the meeting, I am also requesting an FBA, which is a functional behavior assessment, and a BB-MAP assessment, which is the Verbal Behavior Milestones Assessment Placement and Program, be conducted by a BCBA to evaluate why Jay is not progressing both within the classroom and while at recess, where he could gain critical social and language skills. So that's just an example where we're putting it in writing, which is memorializing the meeting. We are putting in writing that Mrs. Smith is concerned too. We're both concerned. We're putting in writing that she's agreed to provide a one-to-one during recess, and that one-to-one needs to be within arm's distance, and that you're also requesting an FBA and a BB-MAP be conducted by a BCBA. That is something that people can't ignore. This would likely go to their supervisor, would get expedited because of the safety risk, might have to have financial meetings about how they're going to get a one-to-one, who they're going to hire to do the BB-MAP and FBA. And so this also could start the clock ticking in terms of requesting that FBA and BB-MAP. So in the United States, all children are entitled to an evaluation and therapy free of charge for their disabilities and their delays. So if you have a child under the age of 3, you can get an in-home evaluation, or at daycare if your child goes to daycare, in-home or at daycare evaluation and therapy. And there is a strong parent component, and you would get an IFSP, which is a individualized family support plan, I believe. Now, once your child turns 3, and that kind of messed us up a little bit because we got the diagnosis the day before Lucas turned 3. So he was in the Birth to 3 program for speech only, and then all of a sudden he turns 3, and now we've got moderate to severe autism with a lot more needs. So ages 3 to 5 or 6 is usually a different system, and it's usually center-based versus home-based. And you would get an IEP, or an individualized education plan. And then school age would be school district funding, again, an IEP. So if you're in the United States, to find out the correct agency that should be doing these evaluations and providing therapy, you would contact your child's pediatrician or school district, or you can Google. Now, if you're outside of the United States, you can still, there probably is some kind of systems. There's also insurance coverage now in many states in the United States. So now we've got the school system or the education system and the insurance company system. And so that's also another area where I've had to do quite a bit of advocating. And like I said, with people outside of the United States, there are probably similar systems. And some of the best ways to find that out, besides your pediatrician or calling your school district, is through other parents who have navigated the system. But for every child, I believe we need to look under the hood and get full evaluations, such as standardized language and IQ testing. If you don't have that standardized language testing, then I would really seriously get it. You know, it's one thing to have somebody diagnose your child with autism, or, you know, go to speech therapy, but to get standardized language assessments. So even though it's usually very painful to look at an evaluation and say, oh, for my 26-month-old, he's got the expressive language ability of a 9-month-old and the receptive language ability of a 12-month-old. That's hard to take, but at the same time, it's really important because you know how delayed he is. And then when somebody tries to go like, oh, I don't think he needs once a week speech, he can go to every other week because he's doing well, you can point back to that 12-month, 9-month level and be like, no, you know, he actually needs twice a week speech because he's so far behind. IQ testing is also something I recommend, even though a lot of children very young will score in the intellectual disability range. Again, it sometimes leads to more services and more prioritizing. Of course, getting an evaluation by a developmental pediatrician is something that I would recommend. A VB-MAP assessment, a functional behavior assessment, and a behavior intervention plan can all be done too. And while these two standardized assessments and evaluation won't really provide us with what to do right this minute, the VB-MAP assessment, an FBA, and a behavior plan will. And so that's why I would do all of them and for a thorough assessment. So in the U.S., from birth to 21, you should be able to get a free evaluation, which leads into an IFSP or IEP, and which provides services. As part of the IEP, and I'm not going to get into a bunch of things about IEPs because I know there's people from different parts of the world here, but one of the important things about an IEP, which school districts and 3 to 5 year old organizations kind of gloss over, and I want you to be aware of this, is in the beginning of an IEP, there are all these check boxes. I think there's like 7 of them. Is the student blind? So you would definitely have, your student would have communication needs, might have limited English proficiency if you're in the United States, and they might need assistive technology devices or services, but you definitely need the communication needs checked, and you definitely need this box checked. Student exhibits behavior that impedes his or her learning or that of others. And I've seen time and time again, both with Lucas as well as many of my clients, people don't want to check this box, because this box being checked means that you need an FBA and a behavior plan, and this box needs to be checked. And people will, even in front of me, I'll be sitting there and they'll be like, oh, well, he's not, flopping to the ground. He's not bothering anybody. I'm thinking, everything he does, he has learning needs that is, his behaviors are impeding his learning for sure. And usually it's impeding everybody's learning. So you just want to make sure that box is checked. And if that box is checked, then it should lead to an FBA, a behavior plan, which should then lead to a goal for behavior reduction, possibly a one-to-one personal care assistant, possibly a BCBA on the child's IEP, and quality data collection, not just a smiley face for a good day. Now you can imagine if you have a 2-year-old right now and you went through this course and saw big transformations, and then he turned 3 and you sent him to whatever program was the next step for your 3-year-old, and he had, a 1-to-2, 1-to-3 ratio, so he was not getting one-to-one instruction. And then at the end of the day, you got a smiley face, or he had a tough day, wouldn't share toys. We need to do much better at documenting progress, having kids make progress. And I don't think that most of the programs, especially if they're not one-to-one and have a BCBA on site, that they are doing the best job they can. One other thing, and I didn't have a slide for this, is try not to use the word best, because I learned early on that, at least in the United States, you're entitled to a free, appropriate public education, otherwise known as FAPE, free, appropriate public education. So appropriate is not best. So if you go in saying, I want the best, and you put in writing, I want the best, if you do end up in due process, that doesn't look good. So you want to use appropriate, even though we all want what's best for the child. Try not to use the word best, both orally and in writing. If there's anything in your IFSP or IEP or in a different country or through the insurance carriers, which if they ask you for parent concerns, or if you're going to a meeting to get therapy, actually draft out your concerns and put them in writing so they can be specific. Because if you get to a meeting and they say, well, what are your concerns? Well, I just want, good programming, or I want, whatever. It's just going to look a little weak. Whereas if you have it in writing and you know what he needs, you want to be specific. I know the 3 to 5 year old programming around my area all does, every 6 weeks, they basically take a 2-week break because they go throughout the summer. But like every 6 weeks to take a 2-week break is not what Lucas needed back then. So I put in writing, he needs break-free programming, he needs evidence-based 40 hours a week of programming, or 20 hours a week of one-to-one programming. You want to include the need based on your child's assessments, research, and your child's success. Even with this program, you want to include the need for ABA, home and school coordination, parent training involvement, one-to-one teaching time for many hours per day, and BCBA oversight. So if a child is going to go somewhere, just make sure that everything, because your IEP or your IFSP is basically your contract. And you want to make sure that that contract is pretty strong. And I know I'm talking about contracts, I'm talking about lots of things here, and I'm just like skimming the surface of what you need to know. So you may need an advocate or a lawyer. I've had a few of both over the years, and since Lucas has been like 10 years old, I haven't needed an advocate or a lawyer because I've become my own advocate.